Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 8 of the most disturbing true camping horror stories ever documented. These are not tales spun from campfire legends or internet folklore, but authentic accounts from individuals whose wilderness expeditions transformed into nightmarish ordeals that haunt them to this day. Each story draws us into the most remote corners of our wilderness, from snow-covered alpine peaks to isolated forest service roads where seasoned campers encountered terrors that defied all explanation. We will journey alongside experienced mountaineers, seasoned backpackers, and wilderness enthusiasts who ventured into places where civilization holds no power and darkness reigns supreme. The testimonies you will hear tonight have been carefully verified and cross-referenced, with every detail preserved to maintain their chilling authenticity. Though certain names and locations have been altered to protect the privacy of those who lived through these harrowing experiences. If you have not yet subscribed to Buried Files, join our community of truth seekers by hitting that subscribe button and activating the notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the stories others dare not tell. Be sure to leave a comment below sharing your own wilderness encounters, or let us know which story disturbed you the most tonight. My name is Henry, and I have been backpacking in the Pacific Northwest for over a decade. I follow all the rules, obtain the proper permits, and respect leave no trace principles religiously. I tell you this because what I discovered in the Olympic National Park wilderness area challenged everything I thought I knew about how our protected lands are managed and who else might be using them. It was late September when I applied for a backcountry permit for a solo hiking trip in the Quinault River drainage. This is a restricted area that requires advance permits limited to only a few parties per day to protect the sensitive ecosystem. I had been trying to get a permit for this particular route for 3 years, and when one finally became available due to a cancellation, I jumped at the opportunity. The permit was for 4 days and 3 nights, allowing me to hike deep into old-growth forest and camp at designated backcountry sites. I had researched the area extensively, studied topographic maps, and read trip reports from other hikers. Everything indicated this would be a spectacular wilderness experience in one of the most pristine forest ecosystems remaining in the lower 48 states. I arrived at the ranger station on a Thursday morning to pick up my permit and receive the mandatory backcountry briefing. The ranger who processed my paperwork seemed unusually serious as she reviewed the regulations with me. She emphasized multiple times that I was to camp only at designated sites, that the permit system existed to protect sensitive areas, and that I should report any violations or unusual activity to park authorities immediately. When I asked if there had been problems with unauthorized camping in the area, she hesitated before answering that they occasionally dealt with people who entered restricted zones without permits. She advised me to be aware of my surroundings and to trust my instincts if anything seemed out of place. I began my hike around 10 in the morning, following the established trail into the Quinault drainage. The path was well maintained for the first few miles, passing through second-growth forest before entering the true wilderness area where old-growth cedars and Douglas firs towered overhead. The forest was cathedral quiet, with shafts of sunlight filtering through the canopy to illuminate patches of moss and ferns on the forest floor. My first designated campsite was approximately 8 miles from the trailhead, positioned beside a small creek that provided water access. According to my permit, I was the only person authorized to camp in this drainage for the next 3 days. The solitude was part of what made these permits so valuable and difficult to obtain. I reached my intended campsite around 4 in the afternoon, giving me plenty of time to set up camp and explore the surrounding area before dark. The site itself was a small clearing beside the creek with the established fire ring and a bear box for food storage. Everything appeared exactly as described in the park materials. But as I began setting up my tent, I noticed something that troubled me. There were signs of recent camping activity that did not match the official records. The fire ring contained fresh ash and partially burned wood that could not have been more than a few days old. More concerning, I found tent stakes in the ground that had obviously been used recently, and the vegetation around the campsite showed clear evidence of foot traffic. According to the permit system, no one should have been camping at this site for at least 2 weeks. The ranger station keeps meticulous records of backcountry use, and they would have informed me if there had been any recent activity in the area. I decided to investigate further before setting up my own camp. Following the creek downstream, I discovered additional evidence of recent human presence. There were more fire rings that did not appear on any official campsite maps, areas where vegetation had been cleared for tent sites, and even some improvised furniture constructed from fallen logs. Someone had been camping in this restricted area without permits, and they had established what appeared to be semi-permanent campsites in locations that were supposed to be off-limits to overnight use. As I continued exploring, I found a trail that branched off from the official hiking route. This path was not marked on any of the maps I carried, and it showed signs of regular use despite being in an area where off-trail travel was prohibited. The trail led deeper into the drainage, toward areas that were designated as research zones with no public access allowed. Following this unauthorized trail for approximately half a mile, I came upon a larger camping area that had clearly been in use for an extended period. There were multiple fire rings, several cleared tent sites, food storage containers that were not the approved bear-proof models, and even some basic shelters constructed from tarps and forest materials. This was not the casual camping of someone who had accidentally wandered into a restricted area. This was an established camp that showed evidence of repeated long-term use by people who knew exactly where they were and had chosen to ignore the permit system entirely. But what disturbed me most was not the unauthorized camping itself, but what I found scattered around the campsite. There were dozens of empty food containers, but not the kind that backpackers typically carry. These were institutional-sized cans and packages, the type used by large groups or commercial operations. I also found equipment that seemed out of place for recreational camping: heavy-duty generators, multiple radio antennas, and electronics equipment that would require significant power sources. Most troubling of all, I discovered what appeared to be research materials. There were waterproof containers filled with data sheets, photographs, and scientific instruments that I did not recognize. Some of the documentation had official-looking letterheads, but the text was partially obscured by water damage, and I could not read the details clearly. As I was examining these materials, I heard voices approaching from deeper in the forest. I immediately retreated from the unauthorized campsite and made my way back toward the official trail as quickly and quietly as possible. The voices were too distant for me to make out words, but I could tell there were multiple people, and they were moving toward the area I had just been investigating. I reached my designated campsite and quickly set up my tent, trying to appear as if I had been there all afternoon. My hands were shaking as I assembled my shelter, both from adrenaline and from the growing realization that I had stumbled into something much more complex than simple permit violations. The voices I had heard never came close enough to my official campsite for me to see who they belonged to, but I could occasionally hear them in the distance throughout the evening. Sometimes they seemed to be coming from the unauthorized camp I had discovered. Other times they appeared to be moving along trails that did not exist on any official maps. I spent a sleepless night in my tent, listening to sounds that suggested ongoing activity in areas where no one should have been present. There were occasional mechanical noises like generators running or vehicles starting, which should have been impossible in a designated wilderness area with no road access. Around 3 in the morning, I heard what sounded distinctly like helicopters passing overhead. This was extremely unusual as aircraft overflights in wilderness areas are heavily regulated and typically only occur for emergency rescues or official park business. When dawn broke, I made a decision that went against every backpacking instinct I had developed over the years. I decided to cut my trip short and hike out immediately. I broke camp as quickly as possible and began hiking toward the trailhead, constantly looking over my shoulder and listening for any signs that I was being followed. The 8-mile hike out felt longer than any distance I had ever covered, and I did not feel safe until I reached my vehicle in the parking area. I drove directly to the ranger station and requested a meeting with the backcountry supervisor. I detailed everything I had observed: the unauthorized campsites, the evidence of long-term occupation, the research materials, and the nocturnal activity that suggested ongoing operations in restricted areas. The ranger who listened to my report took extensive notes and asked detailed questions about locations and descriptions. However, her responses seemed carefully measured, as if she was being cautious about what information she shared with me. When I asked what actions would be taken to investigate the unauthorized activity, she told me that park officials would look into the matter, but that I should not expect to be updated on their findings. She also advised me not to discuss what I had observed with other hikers or on social media, explaining that premature publicity could interfere with any enforcement actions. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from the National Park Service thanking me for my report and informing me that appropriate actions had been taken to address the violations I had witnessed. No details were provided about what those actions entailed or what they had discovered during their investigation. I attempted to obtain another permit for the same area 6 months later, but I was told that the Kino River drainage had been temporarily closed to all public access due to ongoing resource management activities. The closure notice provided no timeline for when public access might be restored. It has now been 18 months since my experience in the Olympic wilderness, and that section of the park remains closed to backcountry camping. I have tried multiple times to get information about the status of the area, but park officials will only say that the closure is necessary for resource protection and that they cannot provide a reopening date. I continue to backpack in other areas of the Pacific Northwest, but I have never again encountered anything like what I observed in the Kino drainage. The experience fundamentally changed my understanding of how our public lands are used and managed. I realized that there are likely legitimate scientific and administrative activities that occur in wilderness areas outside of public view. But what I witnessed did not feel like authorized government research or standard park management operations. The secrecy, the unauthorized camps, and the immediate closure of the area after my report suggested something much more complex and potentially troubling. I have never received a satisfactory explanation for what I encountered during those 4 days in September. The unauthorized activity, the research materials, and the subsequent closure of the area remain unexplained. Sometimes I wonder if I stumbled into something I was never supposed to see, and whether my report was actually welcomed by the park authorities or if it created complications for activities they preferred to keep hidden. What I know for certain is that our wilderness areas are not always as wild or as protected as the public believes them to be. There are people operating in restricted zones with apparent impunity, conducting activities that seem to contradict the very purpose of wilderness designation. I still obtain permits and follow all the regulations when I backpack, but I no longer assume that I am alone in the wilderness simply because the permit system says I should be. My name is Evelyn, and what I am about to tell you happened during what was supposed to be a romantic anniversary camping trip with my boyfriend Jack. We had been together for 3 years, and winter camping had become our shared passion. We were experienced cold weather campers who had successfully completed expeditions in temperatures well below zero. What happened to us in the boundary waters of Minnesota that February night destroyed not only our relationship, but my ability to trust my own perceptions of reality. Jack and I had planned this trip for months. February marked our 3rd anniversary, and we wanted to celebrate somewhere special. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area wilderness in winter transforms into a pristine, frozen landscape that few people ever experience. We had camped there twice before during warmer months, but winter camping offered a completely different kind of beauty and solitude. We drove up from Minneapolis on a Friday afternoon loaded with gear rated for extreme cold conditions. Our equipment list was extensive: 4-season mountaineering tent, sleeping bags rated to -30 degrees, insulated sleeping pads, portable winter shelter, and enough food for 4 days. We had also packed emergency gear, including a satellite communicator, first aid supplies, and extra clothing layers. The temperature when we arrived at the parking area was -12 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind chill bringing it down to -25. This was well within our comfort zone. We had camped in worse conditions and felt confident in our abilities and equipment. The weather forecast showed stable cold for the next 3 days with no precipitation expected. We began skiing into the wilderness area around 3 in the afternoon, pulling our gear behind us on sleds designed for winter camping. The snow was deep and well packed, making for excellent skiing conditions. Our destination was a small island approximately 4 miles from the trailhead, a location we had researched extensively and knew would provide good wind protection and flat ground for our tent. The ski-in went perfectly. We made excellent time despite the heavy sleds, and the scenery was breathtaking. The lakes were frozen solid, covered with a layer of snow that stretched unbroken to the horizon. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of our skis cutting through the snow and our breathing in the cold air. We reached our intended campsite around 5:30, just as the sun was beginning to set. The island was exactly as we had hoped, a small forested area with several level spots suitable for camping. We selected a location among a grove of large pine trees that would provide wind protection while keeping us away from any potential widowmakers overhead. Setting up camp in those conditions required teamwork and attention to detail. We had done this enough times that we moved with practiced efficiency. Jack began stamping down a platform for our tent while I organized our gear and prepared the site. The wind was minimal and the temperature felt manageable with our layered clothing system. Our tent went up without incident. It was a high-quality 4-season shelter that we had used many times before. We secured it with additional guy lines and snow anchors, ensuring it could handle any wind that might develop overnight. By 7 o'clock, we had camp established and were heating water for dinner on our reliable winter stove. The evening started perfectly. We cooked a hot meal, shared a thermos of hot chocolate, and spent time talking and enjoying the incredible night sky. At that latitude in winter with no light pollution, the stars were brilliant beyond description. We could see the Milky Way clearly, and the aurora borealis even made a brief appearance as green curtains dancing across the northern horizon. We retreated into our tent around 9 o'clock, settling into our sleeping bags with books and headlamps. This was always one of my favorite parts of winter camping. The cozy warmth inside the tent while the cold world existed just inches away beyond the thin fabric walls. Jack and I talked quietly about our plans for the next day and our gratitude for being able to share experiences like this together. The first sign that something was wrong came around 11 o'clock. Jack sat up suddenly in his sleeping bag and asked if I had heard something. I had not, but I listened carefully. After a minute or two, I heard it as well, a sound like something moving through the snow around our campsite. It was rhythmic, like footsteps, but heavier than what a person would make. We both remained silent, listening intently. The sound continued for several minutes, seeming to circle our tent at a distance of perhaps 20 or 30 feet. Then it stopped completely. Jack whispered that it was probably a deer or moose moving through the area. This made sense. Large animals do move at night, and we were in their habitat. We had encountered wildlife on previous camping trips, and it had never been a problem. But something about the pattern of movement troubled me. It had been too regular, too deliberate, and it had definitely been circling our camp, which was unusual behavior for most animals. We settled back down, but neither of us could fall asleep easily. Every small sound seemed amplified in the cold air. The normal creaking and settling of our tent in the wind sounded ominous. Even our own breathing seemed loud in the stillness. Around midnight, our stove malfunctioned. We had been using the same stove for 2 years without any problems. It was a high-quality winter model designed specifically for cold weather conditions. But when Jack tried to light it to melt snow for drinking water, it would not function properly. The flame was weak and inconsistent, and it kept going out despite his repeated attempts to adjust the settings. This was concerning because staying hydrated in winter conditions is critical. We needed to be able to melt snow for water, and we needed hot drinks to maintain our core body temperature. Jack worked on the stove for 20 minutes, trying different adjustments and checking all the connections, but he could not get it to work reliably. We decided to use our backup stove, a smaller model we carried for emergencies. But when Jack attempted to light it, we discovered that it was not working either. The igniter was clicking, but no flame would start. This should have been impossible. We had tested both stoves before the trip, and they had been functioning perfectly. Now we were facing a serious situation. Without a functioning stove, we could not melt snow for water or prepare hot food and drinks. In negative temperatures, this could quickly become a life-threatening problem. We had some water remaining in our bottles, but not enough to last through the next day. Jack suggested that we might need to consider cutting the trip short and skiing out in the morning. This was disappointing, but it was the prudent decision given the equipment failure. However, we still needed to get through the current night safely. It was while we were discussing our options that the temperature inside our tent began dropping dramatically. This made no sense. Our tent was designed for extreme cold weather, and we were both in high-quality sleeping bags. The temperature outside had not changed significantly according to our thermometer. But inside the tent, I could see my breath forming thick clouds, and I could feel cold air somehow penetrating our shelter. Jack checked the tent for any tiers or openings that might be letting in cold air. He found nothing. All the zippers were closed, and there were no visible holes in the fabric. Yet the temperature continued to drop. We put on additional clothing layers and pulled our sleeping bags tighter, but the cold seemed to seep through everything. Then we started hearing the breathing. It was not our own breathing. It was coming from outside the tent, slow and deep and deliberate. Something was standing very close to our shelter, close enough that we could hear its respiration clearly. The sound moved around the perimeter of the tent, sometimes stopping directly outside where our heads were positioned. Jack grabbed our flashlight and unzipped the tent door. The beam revealed nothing but undisturbed snow and the dark shapes of trees. But the moment he turned on the light, the breathing sound stopped completely. We waited for 10 minutes before closing the tent again. Within moments of zipping the door shut, the breathing resumed. This pattern continued for the next 3 hours. Every time we investigated with light, we found nothing. Every time we retreated into the tent, the sounds would return. The breathing was sometimes accompanied by other noises. The sound of something large moving through the snow, occasional scraping sounds against the tent fabric, and once, what sounded distinctly like sniffing, as if something was trying to identify our scent. By 4 in the morning, we were both showing signs of hypothermia despite our high-quality gear. Our core body temperatures were dropping, and we were shivering uncontrollably. This should not have been happening with our equipment and experience level. but our bodies were losing heat faster than we could generate it. Jack made the decision to activate our emergency satellite communicator and request rescue. In normal circumstances, this would have been embarrassing for experienced winter campers like ourselves. But something was fundamentally wrong with our situation, and our lives were potentially at risk. The rescue team reached us at 8 in the morning, skiing in with the emergency sled and additional warming equipment. They found us both suffering from mild hypothermia and dehydration. What they could not explain was why our gear had failed so completely, or why we had lost so much body heat in conditions that should have been manageable. The paramedics were puzzled by our stoves, which worked perfectly when they tested them. Our tent showed no signs of damage or air leaks. According to all physical evidence, our equipment was functioning exactly as designed. Yet we had nearly died from exposure in gear that should have kept us safe and warm. The rescue team skied us out to the parking area, where we were evaluated by medical personnel and released after warming up and rehydrating. Physically, we recovered completely within a few hours. Psychologically, the damage was permanent. Jack and I never went camping together again. We tried to discuss what had happened, but we could never agree on an explanation. He believed it was a combination of equipment failure and panic that had caused us to overreact to normal winter camping challenges. I knew that something had been stalking us that night, something that had deliberately sabotaged our equipment and systematically tried to drive us into hypothermia. Our relationship ended 2 months later. Some experiences reveal fundamental differences in how people perceive reality, and what happened to us in the Boundary Waters was one of those experiences. I never returned to winter camping. The memory of that breathing in the darkness and the knowledge that something had tried to kill us through cold and fear changed my relationship with the wilderness forever. My name is Abigail, and this story involves my boyfriend Samuel and myself. We are what you might call overlanders, people who prefer to find remote camping spots accessible only by four-wheel drive vehicles rather than staying in established campgrounds. We have been exploring Forest Service roads throughout the Pacific Northwest for 5 years, seeking solitude and pristine camping locations far from crowds. What happened to us on a remote Forest Service road in Oregon's Cascade Mountains changed our approach to wilderness camping forever. It was early October when Samuel and I decided to explore an area of the Willamette National Forest that we had never visited before. We had been studying Forest Service maps and satellite imagery for weeks, identifying a network of Forest Service roads that appeared to provide access to high-elevation meadows and old-growth forest areas. These roads were marked on maps but showed no recent maintenance dates, which usually indicated minimal traffic and excellent dispersed camping opportunities. Our vehicle was well equipped for Forest Service road travel. A lifted four-wheel drive pickup truck with oversized tires, recovery equipment, and a complete camping setup in the truck bed. We carried enough food, water, and fuel for a week of self-sufficient camping, along with communication equipment including a satellite messenger for emergencies. We left Portland on a Friday afternoon, driving east toward the Cascade Mountains. Our plan was to access the Forest Service road network from Highway 22, then explore several branching roads until we found a suitable camping location for the weekend. The weather forecast was favorable, with clear skies and mild temperatures expected for the next 3 days. The first part of our journey proceeded exactly as planned. We turned off the highway onto Forest Service Road 2261, a well-maintained gravel road that provided access to several wilderness trailheads. Traffic was light, consisting mainly of other weekend recreationalists heading to established camping areas. After approximately 15 miles, we turned onto a smaller Forest Service road that branched north toward our target area. This road was narrower and showed less maintenance, but it was still easily passable with our vehicle. The surrounding forest was beautiful, with dense stands of Douglas fir and occasional openings that provided views of distant peaks. As we continued deeper into the Forest Service road system, the roads became progressively narrower and more challenging. We passed through several intersections where our GPS showed multiple branching routes, some of which were not marked with road numbers or destination signs. We carefully tracked our route, making notes about landmarks and road conditions so we could find our way back to the main highway. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we found what appeared to be an ideal camping location. A small meadow beside a creek accessible by a short spur road that ended in a natural parking area. The site offered level ground for camping, water access, and excellent views of the surrounding forest. Most importantly, it showed no signs of recent human activity, which suggested we would have complete privacy for the weekend. Samuel parked the truck at the edge of the meadow and we began setting up our campsite. We established our kitchen area, deployed our camping chairs, and prepared to enjoy a peaceful evening in the wilderness. Everything felt perfect. The location was exactly what we had hoped to find: beautiful, remote, and completely private. As the sun began to set, we prepared dinner and opened a bottle of wine to celebrate finding such an excellent camping spot. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of water moving in the nearby creek and the occasional call of birds settling in for the night. This was what we loved most about overlanding: the ability to reach places where we could experience true solitude and connection with nature. It was around 8 o'clock when we first noticed the tire tracks. Samuel had walked down to the creek to collect water for cleaning our dishes when he called me over to look at something. In the soft earth beside the water, there were fresh tire tracks that clearly had not been there when we arrived. The tracks were from a large vehicle much bigger than our pickup truck, and they led from the creek bank back toward the Forest Service road. This was puzzling because we had not heard any vehicles pass our location since we had arrived. The Forest Service road we had used to reach this area was the only access route, and it passed within 50 yards of our campsite. Any vehicle large enough to make those tracks should have been clearly audible as it approached and departed. We followed the tire tracks back toward the main road, using our flashlights to examine the ground carefully. The tracks were definitely fresh, made within the last few hours, and they showed tread patterns consistent with heavy-duty truck or equipment tires. But when we reached the Forest Service road, the tracks seemed to disappear on the harder packed surface. Samuel suggested that we might have missed seeing a vehicle while we were busy setting up camp or preparing dinner. This seemed like the most logical explanation, although neither of us could understand how we could have failed to hear a large truck passing so close to our location. We returned to our campsite, but the discovery of the mysterious tire tracks had created an undercurrent of unease that affected the rest of our evening. We found ourselves listening more carefully to forest sounds, trying to distinguish between normal wildlife activity and any indication of human presence in the area. Around 10 o'clock, we decided to retire to our tent for the night. We had a comfortable sleeping setup in the back of our truck, which provided both security and elevation above ground level. As experienced overlanders, we always felt safer sleeping in our vehicle rather than in a ground tent when camping in remote locations. It was approximately midnight when we were awakened by the sound of vehicles. Multiple vehicles moving slowly along the Forest Service road without headlights. We could hear the low rumble of diesel engines and the sound of tires on gravel. But when we looked out through our truck windows, we could see no lights anywhere in the darkness. Samuel quietly opened the truck door and stepped outside to get a better view of the road. He whispered back to me that he could hear at least 3 different vehicles moving in convoy formation, all traveling without any visible lights. The sound grew louder as they approached our area, then began to fade as they continued past our location. We remained awake and alert for the next hour, listening for any indication that the vehicles might return or that people might approach our campsite. The forest had returned to its normal nighttime quiet, with only the usual sounds of wind in trees and water in the creek. In the morning, we investigated the Forest Service road where we had heard the vehicles passing. On the packed gravel surface, we found fresh tire tracks from multiple large vehicles. The tracks were deep and clear, indicating heavy loads, and they showed the same tread patterns we had found beside the creek the previous evening. More troubling, we discovered that some of the tire tracks led down a Forest Service road that our maps showed as permanently closed. There was a metal gate across this road with official Forest Service signs indicating that access was prohibited. But the gate was standing open and the lock appeared to have been cut recently. Samuel wanted to investigate further, but I argued that we should leave the area immediately. Whatever activity was occurring on these remote Forest Service roads after midnight involving multiple heavy vehicles traveling without lights was not something that recreational campers should become involved with. We were in the process of breaking camp when we noticed that we were being watched. There was a man standing in the tree line approximately 100 yards from our campsite. He was not attempting to hide, but he was also not approaching or making any effort to communicate with us. He simply stood there, watching our activities as we packed our camping equipment. Samuel called out a greeting, but the man did not respond. When Samuel began walking toward the tree line, the man retreated deeper into the forest and disappeared from view. We searched the area where he had been standing and found clear evidence that someone had been observing our campsite for an extended period. The vegetation was trampled in a pattern that suggested a person had been sitting or crouching in that location for hours. This discovery accelerated our departure preparations significantly. We loaded our truck as quickly as possible and drove back toward the main Forest Service road, constantly checking our mirrors for any signs that we were being followed. As we reached the first major intersection, we encountered a problem that confirmed our decision to leave the area immediately. A large tree had been felled across the Forest Service road, completely blocking our intended route back to the highway. The tree had obviously been cut recently, as the sawdust was still fresh and the cut showed clear chainsaw marks. Someone had deliberately blocked the road after we had passed through the previous day. Fortunately, Samuel had been carefully tracking our route, and he remembered an alternate Forest Service road that should connect back to the highway system. However, this alternate route required us to drive deeper into the area where we had observed the mysterious nighttime vehicle activity. We had no choice but to take the alternate route. As we drove along the narrow Forest Service road, we passed several locations where we observed clear evidence of recent heavy vehicle traffic and some kind of industrial activity. There were areas where vegetation had been cleared, large tire ruts and soft ground, and even some temporary structures that appeared to be equipment storage facilities. Most disturbing, we passed two locations where armed men in civilian clothing were stationed beside the road. They made no attempt to stop us, but they watched our vehicle carefully as we passed, and I had the distinct impression that our license plate number was being recorded. We reached the highway without further incident, but the drive back to Portland was tense and largely silent. Both Samuel and I felt that we had inadvertently stumbled into some kind of illegal operation, and we were uncertain about what actions we should take. After much discussion, we decided to report our observations to the Forest Service. We contacted the Ranger District Office and described the blocked road, the evidence of unauthorized vehicle activity, and the armed individuals we had encountered. The Forest Service representative we spoke with took detailed notes and thanked us for the report. However, when we asked what kind of investigation would be conducted, we were told that the information would be passed to appropriate authorities, but that we should not expect to be contacted with follow-up information. Samuel and I continue to explore Forest Service roads throughout the Pacific Northwest, but we have never returned to that area of the Willamette National Forest. We also changed our camping practices to include more careful research about recent activity reports and closer attention to signs that areas might be used for purposes other than recreation. The experience taught us that remote Forest Service roads are not always as unpopulated as they appear on maps, and that there are activities occurring in our national forests that recreational users are not supposed to witness. I have always considered myself an experienced mountaineer. Over the past 15 years, I have conquered peaks across the Rockies, the Cascades, and even attempted Denali twice. I tell you this not to boast, but to establish that what happened to me on Mount Elbert in Colorado cannot be dismissed as the hallucinations of an inexperienced climber or someone suffering from altitude sickness. My name is Luke, and what I experienced at 11,000 feet elevation changed my relationship with the mountains forever. It was early February when I decided to attempt a winter summit of Mount Elbert. The weather forecast showed a brief window of clear skies, and I had been planning this solo expedition for months. Winter mountaineering had always been my specialty. There is something profoundly peaceful about the silence of snow-covered peaks, the way the world becomes muffled and pristine. I had successfully completed winter ascents before, including several 14ers in similar conditions. This should have been routine. I began my ascent at 4 in the morning, headlamp cutting through the pre-dawn darkness as I navigated the snow-packed trail. The temperature hovered around -15 degrees Fahrenheit, but my gear was rated for much worse. I wore my standard winter setup: insulated mountaineering boots, 4-season tent, -20 sleeping bag, and enough food for 3 days. The weight of my pack felt familiar and reassuring against my shoulders. The first few hours of climbing progressed exactly as expected. I made good time despite the deep snow, following the established winter route with my GPS and compass as backup. The sun rose behind the eastern peaks, painting the snow in brilliant shades of orange and pink. It was the kind of morning that reminds you why you chase these experiences, why you push your body to its limits in pursuit of something transcendent. By noon, I had reached the tree line at approximately 10,000 feet. This is where the landscape transforms from forested slopes to the harsh, wind-scoured terrain of the alpine zone. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees and the wind had picked up significantly. I stopped to add another layer and check my position. According to my GPS, I was making excellent progress and should reach my planned camping spot well before dark. The planned camping location was a small, relatively sheltered area at 11,000 feet, still below the summit but high enough to make the final push manageable the next morning. I had researched this spot extensively, studying topographic maps and reading reports from other winter climbers. It offered some protection from the prevailing winds while maintaining access to the summit route. As I continued climbing, the terrain became increasingly challenging. The snow was deeper than anticipated, sometimes reaching above my knees even with snowshoes. Each step required deliberate effort, and I could feel my heart rate elevated from the combination of exertion and altitude. But this was normal. This was what I had trained for. I reached my intended camping spot around 3 in the afternoon, giving me plenty of time to establish camp before darkness fell. The location appeared perfect, a small depression in the mountainside that would provide wind protection with relatively level ground for my tent. The snow was packed firm enough to support my weight without requiring extensive digging. Setting up camp at altitude in winter conditions is a methodical process that cannot be rushed. I began by stamping down a platform for my tent, then carefully assembled the structure, ensuring every stake was secure and every guy line properly tensioned. The wind was constant but manageable, creating that familiar whistling sound as it moved across the exposed ridges above me. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, I completed my camp setup and prepared dinner on my compact stove. The routine of melting snow for water, heating my meal, and organizing my gear for the night provided a sense of normalcy and control. I had done this dozens of times before. Nothing felt out of the ordinary. Darkness fell quickly at that altitude the way it does in the mountains during winter. I retreated into my tent around 7 o'clock, settling into my sleeping bag with a book and headlamp. The wind continued its steady rhythm outside, occasionally gusting strong enough to flex the tent walls. This was expected and did not concern me. It was around 9 o'clock when I first heard the sound. At first, I dismissed it as wind moving through rock formations or perhaps settling snow. It was a low, resonant tone that seemed to echo from somewhere above my position. But as I listened more carefully, I realized the sound had a pattern to it. It would rise and fall in pitch, sometimes lasting for several seconds, then stopping completely before starting again. I unzipped my tent and looked outside. The night was clear, with stars brilliant in the thin air. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see the surrounding terrain clearly. Everything appeared normal. The sound had stopped. I returned to my sleeping bag, convincing myself it was simply an acoustic phenomenon I had not encountered before. Mountains create strange sounds, especially at night when temperature differences cause rock to expand and contract. I had heard rockfall, avalanches, and ice cracking. This was probably something similar. But the sound returned an hour later, and this time it was closer. The tone was deeper now, more resonant, and it seemed to be moving. It would start from one direction, then shift to another, as if the source was circling my camp. I grabbed my headlamp and stepped outside again, scanning the area systematically. The beam of my light reached perhaps 50 yards in the clear air, illuminating nothing but snow and rock formations. The sound stopped the moment I turned on my light. I stood outside my tent for 15 minutes, listening and watching. The normal sounds of the mountain night surrounded me. Wind across stone, the occasional creak of settling snow, the distant hoot of an owl from far below the tree line. But the strange, resonant tone remained absent. I went back inside, but sleep became impossible. Every few minutes, the sound would return. Sometimes it seemed to come from directly above my position, as if something was moving along the ridgeline overhead. Other times, it appeared to originate from the valley below, echoing up the mountainside in a way that made it impossible to determine the exact location. Around midnight, the pattern changed. Instead of the long, sustained tones, I began hearing what sounded like voices. Not words I could understand, but definitely vocal sounds with the cadence and rhythm of speech. Multiple voices, sometimes overlapping, sometimes responding to each other in what resembled a conversation. This was when my rational mind began to struggle with what I was experiencing. I knew I was alone on this mountain. The winter climbing season meant very few people attempted these peaks, and I had seen no other vehicles at the trailhead. The nearest maintained trail was miles away, and the terrain between my position and any other possible camping areas was extremely difficult to navigate, especially at night. But I was hearing voices. I forced myself to consider logical explanations. Sound travels strangely at altitude, especially in cold, thin air. Perhaps I was hearing voices from much farther away than seemed possible. Maybe there were other climbers on a distant peak, and the acoustic properties of the terrain were carrying their conversation to my location. This explanation satisfied me for approximately 10 minutes, until I realized the voices were responding to my movements. When I shifted position inside my tent, the voices would stop. When I remained still, they would resume. When I unzipped my tent to look outside, immediate silence. When I retreated inside, the conversation would begin again within minutes. By 2 in the morning, I was questioning my own sanity. I had been at altitude for over 12 hours, which was not long enough for serious altitude sickness, but perhaps the combination of exertion, cold and thin air was affecting my perception. I checked my pulse oximeter. My oxygen saturation was 92%, which was normal for that elevation. My heart rate was elevated, but that could easily be attributed to stress and adrenaline. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the voices would start again. They seemed closer now, sometimes appearing to come from just outside my tent. I could hear the distinct sounds of movement in the snow, the crunch of footsteps circling my campsite. At 3:30 in the morning, something touched my tent. It was not the wind. Wind does not move with such deliberate pressure, pressing against the fabric from outside and then moving systematically around the perimeter. I could feel something tracing the outline of my shelter, running along the guy lines, testing the stability of the stakes. I grabbed my ice axe and headlamp, my heart hammering against my chest. Whatever was outside my tent was large enough to create significant pressure against the walls, and it was moving with obvious intelligence and purpose. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The movement stopped instantly. I waited in absolute silence for 5 minutes before slowly unzipping my tent. My headlamp beam revealed pristine snow around my campsite. No footprints, no disturbance of any kind. The snow lay exactly as I had left it when setting up camp, but I knew something had been there. I had felt its presence, felt the pressure of its movement against my tent. The physical evidence of my senses could not all be wrong. I spent the remaining hours until dawn sitting upright in my sleeping bag, ice axe across my knees, listening to sounds that defied explanation, and watching for movement that never materialized when I looked for it directly. When the sun finally rose, I broke camp as quickly as possible and began my descent. I never attempted the summit. I never returned to winter mountaineering. Some experiences change you fundamentally, and what happened to me at 11,000 feet on Mount Elbert was one of those experiences. I still do not know what I encountered that night, but I know it was real, and I know it was not human. My name is Dylan, and I have been kayak camping in the Great Lakes region for 8 years. I am an experienced paddler who has completed solo expeditions across Lake Superior, Lake Huron, and Lake Michigan. I am familiar with the challenges of Great Lakes kayaking. Sudden weather changes, cold water temperatures, and the isolation that comes with camping on remote islands dozens of miles from shore. What I experienced on a small island in northern Lake Michigan during a solo expedition last summer was unlike anything I had encountered in all my years of wilderness paddling. I had planned a 10-day solo kayak expedition along the northern shore of Lake Michigan with the intention of island hopping between several small uninhabited islands that offered primitive camping opportunities. These islands are accessible only by boat and receive very few visitors due to their remote locations and the challenging paddle required to reach them. My route was carefully planned to take advantage of favorable weather windows and to provide bailout options in case conditions became dangerous. I carried a complete set of safety equipment, including a satellite communicator, marine radio, signal flares, and cold water survival gear. My kayak was loaded with 10 days of food, camping equipment, and fresh water. The first 3 days of the expedition went perfectly. I paddled approximately 20 miles per day, camping on 2 different islands that offered excellent campsites with fresh water sources and protection from prevailing winds. The weather was stable with light winds and mild temperatures, ideal conditions for Great Lakes kayaking. On the 4th day, I was paddling toward my planned destination when the weather began to deteriorate rapidly. What had started as a calm morning with light winds quickly developed into conditions with 4-foot swells and increasing wind speeds. The weather forecast had not predicted this change, but Great Lakes weather can be notoriously unpredictable. As the conditions worsened, I realized that continuing to my planned destination would be dangerous. I needed to find shelter immediately before the waves became too large for safe paddling. Consulting my chart, I identified a small island approximately 3 miles from my current position that could provide emergency shelter. The paddle to the island was challenging but manageable. The waves were building steadily, and I had to time my approach carefully to avoid being swept onto the rocky shoreline. I managed to land my kayak in a small protected cove on the leeward side of the island and dragged it well above the waterline before the conditions could worsen further. The island was smaller than I had anticipated from studying the charts, perhaps only 2 acres in total area. It was heavily forested with mature pine and cedar trees, and it showed no obvious signs of recent human visitation. There was no established campsite, but I found a relatively level area among the trees where I could set up my tent with some protection from the wind. As I was setting up camp, I discovered the first indication that this island had a disturbing history. While clearing an area for my tent, I uncovered what appeared to be the remains of a stone foundation, partially buried under decades of fallen leaves and forest debris. The stonework was clearly human-made, but it was much older than anything that should have existed on such a remote island. The stones were fitted together with a precision that suggested skilled craftsmanship, and the foundation appeared to be the remnants of a structure that had been deliberately dismantled rather than simply abandoned. I continued exploring the island while waiting for the weather to improve, and I made additional discoveries that increased my unease about this place. Near the center of the island, I found what appeared to be a small cemetery. There were no headstones or markers, but the ground showed clear evidence of graves. Rectangular depressions in the earth arranged in neat rows, each approximately 6 feet long. Some of the depressions were quite old, partially filled with debris and overgrown with vegetation. Others appeared much more recent, with disturbed soil and minimal plant growth. Most troubling of all, I found evidence that this cemetery was still in use. At the far end of the burial area, there were 2 graves that appeared to have been dug within the last few months. The soil was fresh, and there were tool marks visible in the earth around the grave sites. Someone had been bringing bodies to this remote island and burying them in this hidden cemetery, and they had been doing so recently. I also discovered remnants of what appeared to be a dock or landing area on the opposite side of the island from where I had made my emergency landing. The structure was mostly collapsed, but I could see the remains of wooden pilings and decking materials. This suggested that the island had been accessible by boat in the past, and that people had been transporting heavy materials or equipment to this location. As I continued investigating, I found additional evidence of the island's dark history. There were rusted metal objects partially buried throughout the forest, tools, containers, and what appeared to be restraints or shackles. I also discovered the remains of several buildings identifiable only by their stone foundations and scattered debris. The weather conditions prevented me from leaving the island that day, so I was forced to spend the night in a location that I increasingly suspected had been the site of activities I did not want to understand. I set up my tent as far as possible from the cemetery area, but the island was small enough that I could not escape the knowledge of what lay hidden in the forest around me. As darkness fell, I found myself listening intently to every sound, trying to distinguish between normal forest noises and any indication that I was not alone on the island. Around midnight, I was awakened by sounds that confirmed my worst fears. I could hear the low rumble of a boat engine approaching the island. The sound grew steadily louder, suggesting a large vessel moving slowly through the darkness without running lights. I remained in my tent, afraid to investigate but unable to ignore what was happening outside. The engine noise stopped, presumably when the boat reached the collapsed dock area on the far side of the island. For the next hour, I could hear voices and the sounds of people moving through the forest. They were not attempting to be quiet, and their conversation carried clearly through the still night air, although I could not make out specific words from my position. Most terrifying of all, I could hear the distinct sounds of digging. Someone was excavating in the cemetery area, working methodically with shovels and other tools. The digging continued for over 2 hours, accompanied by occasional conversation and the sound of heavy objects being moved. Eventually, the activity ceased, and I heard the boat engine start again. The vessel departed as quietly as it had arrived, leaving me alone on the island with the knowledge that I had witnessed something I was never supposed to see. I spent the remainder of the night sleepless and terrified, afraid that the people who had been on the island might return, and afraid of what I might discover if I investigated the cemetery area in daylight. When dawn broke, the weather conditions had improved enough for me to attempt departure. I broke camp as quickly as possible and prepared my kayak for launch, desperate to leave the island and its secrets behind. But before departing, I felt compelled to confirm what had happened during the night. I walked to the cemetery area and found exactly what I had feared. A new grave had been dug, and it had been filled and covered during the nighttime activity. The soil was fresh, and there were clear signs that a body had been buried in the location. I also found additional evidence that this was an ongoing operation. There were tool marks in trees that suggested the cemetery area was regularly maintained and expanded. I discovered a cache of digging tools hidden under a tarp, and I found what appeared to be a logbook wrapped in plastic and buried under a pile of stones. I did not examine the logbook closely, but I could see that it contained dates, numbers, and what appeared to be location coordinates. This suggested that the island cemetery was part of a systematic operation, with careful records being kept of the burials. I left the island immediately and paddled hard toward the mainland, covering the remaining distance to my planned exit point in record time. The crossing was challenging due to residual wave action from the previous day's storm, but I was motivated by an overwhelming need to reach civilization and report what I had discovered. When I reached shore, I contacted local law enforcement and provided a detailed account of my observations. The officers who took my report seemed skeptical at first, but they became more interested when I provided specific GPS coordinates for the island and described the evidence I had found. I was told that my report would be forwarded to appropriate authorities and that an investigation would be conducted, but I was also advised not to discuss my observations publicly while the investigation was ongoing. Several weeks later, I received a brief communication informing me that authorities had visited the island and had found evidence supporting my report. No details were provided about what actions had been taken or what they had discovered during their investigation. I have continued kayak camping in the Great Lakes, but I have never returned to that area of Lake Michigan. The experience fundamentally changed my understanding of how remote islands can be used by people who prefer to conduct their activities away from public scrutiny. I realized that there are likely legitimate explanations for some of what I observed, but the combination of the hidden cemetery, the nighttime burial activity, and the systematic record-keeping suggested something much more sinister than simple illegal dumping or abandoned property. What I know for certain is that some of the most remote and seemingly uninhabited places in our Great Lakes region are not as empty as they appear on navigation charts. There are people who use these isolated locations for purposes that they prefer to keep hidden from the general public, and recreational paddlers like myself can inadvertently stumble into situations that put us at risk. I still love kayak camping and exploring remote islands, but I am much more careful now about researching the history of locations before I visit them, and I always make sure someone knows my exact route and expected return date. My name is Elizabeth, and I have been alpine climbing in Colorado for 12 years. I am an experienced mountaineer who has summited over 30 peaks above 14,000 feet, including several technical winter ascents. I am familiar with avalanche safety, weather assessment, and high-altitude emergency procedures. What happened to me during a solo climbing attempt on Mount of the Holy Cross last winter challenged everything I thought I understood about mountain safety and the forces that operate in high alpine environments. I had been planning this particular winter ascent for 2 years, waiting for the right combination of weather conditions, snow stability, and personal schedule availability. Mount of the Holy Cross is a challenging peak under normal conditions, and winter attempts require extensive preparation and careful timing. The route I planned would take me through avalanche-prone terrain, but the recent snow conditions appeared stable according to the Colorado Avalanche Information Center forecasts. I began my approach on a Thursday morning in early February, carrying full winter mountaineering equipment including avalanche safety gear, emergency shelter, and enough supplies for 3 days. The weather forecast showed a brief high-pressure window with clear skies and minimal wind. Ideal conditions for a winter summit attempt. The first day of climbing progressed exactly as planned. I established a high camp at approximately 11,000 feet, well above tree line, in a location that provided some protection from prevailing winds while avoiding known avalanche paths. The evening was clear and calm, and all weather indicators suggested stable conditions for the summit attempt the following day. I woke before dawn and began my summit push at 4 in the morning, climbing by headlamp through the pre-dawn darkness. The snow conditions were excellent, firm enough to support my weight without requiring excessive energy expenditure. I made good progress up the standard winter route, carefully avoiding areas where avalanche danger might be elevated. As the sun rose, I could see the entire route ahead of me clearly. The snow appeared stable throughout the avalanche zones I would need to traverse, and there were no obvious signs of recent avalanche activity or unstable snow conditions. Everything suggested that my assessment of the conditions had been accurate and that the summit was achievable safely. It was around 9 in the morning when I first began experiencing the warnings. I cannot describe these warnings as sounds or voices in any conventional sense, but I was receiving clear mental impressions that I should not continue climbing. The impressions were urgent and specific, warning me about avalanche danger in areas where my own assessment indicated the snow was stable. At first, I dismissed these impressions as pre-summit anxiety, something that many climbers experience when approaching technically challenging terrain. But as I continued climbing, the warnings became more insistent and specific. I was receiving detailed information about snow conditions, weather changes, and route hazards that contradicted my own observations and the official avalanche forecasts. The warnings were telling me that I was climbing into an avalanche zone where the snow was much less stable than it appeared, and that continuing would result in being caught in a massive slide that would occur within the next few hours. I stopped climbing and conducted a thorough snow stability assessment, digging test pits and examining the snow layers carefully. Everything I observed confirmed that the snow was stable and that avalanche risk was minimal. The snow showed good bonding between layers, there were no obvious weak layers or faceted grains, and the weather conditions were not conducive to avalanche formation. But the warnings continued, becoming more urgent and detailed. I was receiving specific information about the exact location where the avalanche would initiate, the size and destructive power of the slide, and even the time when it would occur. According to the warnings, a massive avalanche would sweep the entire face I was climbing at approximately 11:30 in the morning, triggered by a cornice collapse high on the mountain that would occur when the sun warmed the snow structures sufficiently. I looked up toward the areas where cornices typically form on this peak, but I could see no obvious instability or signs that collapse was imminent. The cornices appeared well consolidated, and the warming from the morning sun had been gradual and moderate. Despite my rational assessment that the warnings were unfounded, I found myself unable to continue climbing. The mental impressions were so strong and specific that they overrode my technical knowledge and experience. Against my better judgment, I decided to retreat from the mountain and abandon the summit attempt. I began descending immediately, moving as quickly as safety allowed while still maintaining proper climbing technique. As I retreated, the warnings gradually decreased in intensity, but I continued to receive impressions that I should move faster and get below the avalanche zone as soon as possible. I had descended approximately 500 feet when I heard the sound that confirmed the accuracy of the warnings. High above my position, there was a sharp crack, followed by a low rumbling that quickly built into a roar. A massive cornice had collapsed exactly where and when the warnings had indicated it would, triggering an avalanche that swept down the entire face I had been climbing just minutes earlier. The avalanche was enormous, much larger than anything the current snow conditions should have produced. It carried thousands of tons of snow and debris down the mountain face, completely covering the route I had been following and extending far beyond the typical avalanche zones for this peak. If I had continued climbing according to my original plan, I would have been directly in the path of the avalanche when it occurred. The slide was so large and powerful that it would have been unsurvivable regardless of my avalanche safety equipment or emergency procedures. I watched the avalanche from my safe position below the debris zone, stunned by its size and destructive power. The entire character of the mountain had changed within minutes, with the avalanche depositing debris across areas that had been clear climbing terrain just moments earlier. As the avalanche settled and the mountain returned to silence, I realized that I had been saved by warnings that came from a source I could not identify or explain. The information I had received was completely accurate and much more detailed than anything my own knowledge and experience could have provided. I completed my descent to base camp and hiked out to the trailhead, constantly replaying the experience and trying to understand what had happened. I had received specific, accurate information about mountain conditions that proved to be correct despite contradicting all conventional assessment methods. When I reported the avalanche to the Colorado Avalanche Information Center, the forecasters were surprised by its occurrence and magnitude. According to their analysis, current snow conditions should not have produced an avalanche of that size, and there had been no indicators suggesting that such a slide was likely. The avalanche was eventually classified as an unusual event that occurred due to a combination of factors that were not apparent through standard snow stability assessment techniques. The cornice collapse that triggered the slide was attributed to subtle warming effects that were not detectable through normal weather monitoring. I have continued alpine climbing since this experience, but my approach to mountain safety has changed fundamentally. I now pay attention to intuitive impressions and warnings that cannot be explained through conventional assessment methods, and I have learned to trust these impressions even when they contradict my technical knowledge. I have spoken with other experienced mountaineers about this experience, and several have shared similar stories of receiving warnings or guidance that helped them avoid dangerous situations in the mountains. These experiences suggest that there are sources of information about mountain conditions that operate beyond our normal understanding of weather, snow science, and avalanche dynamics. I do not claim to understand the source of the warnings that saved my life on Mount of the Holy Cross, but I know that they were accurate, and that following them prevented me from being killed in an avalanche that should not have occurred according to conventional forecasting methods. The experience has taught me that mountain environments operate according to forces and patterns that are not fully understood by current scientific knowledge, and that experienced climbers need to remain open to information that comes from sources beyond traditional safety assessment techniques. I still climb regularly in Colorado's high peaks, but I approach each mountain with greater humility and respect for the unknown variables that can influence safety in high alpine environments. The mountains have their own intelligence, and sometimes that intelligence communicates with those who are willing to listen. What I know for certain is that there are protective forces operating in mountain environments that can provide crucial safety information to climbers who find themselves in dangerous situations. These forces saved my life, and I believe they continue to operate for other mountaineers who encounter conditions beyond their ability to assess through conventional means. The avalanche on Mount of the Holy Cross was a reminder that the mountains are much more complex and unpredictable than our current understanding suggests, and that survival sometimes depends on receiving and acting upon information that comes from sources we cannot identify or explain. My name is Chloe, and this story involves my best friend Grace and myself on what was supposed to be a week-long canoe expedition in the remote wilderness of northern Ontario, Canada. We are both experienced wilderness canoeists who have completed multiple expeditions in bear country and challenging remote locations. We are familiar with wildlife encounters, proper food storage procedures, and wilderness safety protocols. What stalked us during our trip into the Quetico Provincial Park wilderness was unlike any animal either of us had encountered before. Grace and I had been planning this expedition for over a year, researching remote canoe routes that would take us deep into pristine wilderness areas rarely visited by other paddlers. The route we selected would require 7 days of paddling and portaging through a chain of interconnected lakes and rivers, camping at remote sites accessible only by canoe. We obtained all necessary permits and completed extensive preparation, including bear safety training and wilderness first aid certification. Our food was stored in approved bear canisters, and we carried bear spray, noisemakers, and other wildlife deterrent equipment. We had canoed together for 6 years and felt confident in our abilities to handle whatever challenges the wilderness might present. We began our expedition on a Monday morning in late August, launching from a remote access point that required a 2-hour drive down logging roads to reach. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and calm water conditions ideal for paddling. Our canoe was loaded with 7 days of food, camping equipment, and safety gear, but we had packed efficiently and the weight was manageable. The first 3 days of the expedition were exactly what we had hoped for. We paddled through pristine wilderness areas, camped at beautiful remote sites, and encountered normal wildlife, including moose, beaver, and various bird species. The bear sign we observed was minimal and appeared old, suggesting low bear activity in the area. On the 4th day, we paddled into a large lake system that marked the most remote section of our route. According to our maps, we were now over 20 miles from the nearest road access, surrounded by hundreds of square miles of uninterrupted wilderness. The lake was beautiful, but somehow different from the waters we had been traveling. It felt more isolated, more wild, and strangely quiet despite its size. We established camp that evening on a small island near the center of the lake. The campsite offered excellent views in all directions and would allow us to spot any approaching wildlife well before it could reach our location. We followed our normal routine, setting up camp, hanging our food at the required distance and height, and preparing dinner before darkness fell. It was during dinner preparation that we first noticed something was wrong with the local wildlife behavior. The normal sounds of wilderness evening were absent. There were no loons calling, no beaver splashing, no sounds of birds settling for the night. The silence was so complete that we could hear our own heartbeats, and the small sounds of our camp activities seemed unnaturally loud. Grace commented that perhaps we had arrived during a natural quiet period, but I had spent enough time in wilderness areas to know that this level of silence was unusual. Something had caused all the wildlife in the area to become inactive or to leave entirely. We completed our dinner and evening camp routine, but both of us felt uneasy about the unnatural quiet. We decided to hang our food earlier than usual and to keep our bear spray easily accessible throughout the night. Around 10 o'clock, as we were settling into our tent, we heard the first sounds that indicated we were not alone on the lake. There was splashing in the water, but not the random splashing of fish or beaver activity. This was rhythmic and deliberate, like something large swimming in a straight line toward our island. The splashing continued for several minutes, then stopped abruptly when it seemed to reach the shoreline of our island. Grace and I remained silent in our tent, listening carefully for any indication of what had approached our campsite. We heard nothing for approximately 15 minutes, then detected sounds of movement in the forest around our camping area. Whatever was circling our camp was large enough to break branches as it moved, but it was moving with unusual stealth for something of that size. We could hear occasional footfalls and the sound of vegetation being disturbed, but the movement pattern was unlike anything we had experienced with bears, moose, or other large wildlife. Most disturbing was the fact that it seemed to be deliberately circling our campsite, maintaining a consistent distance from our tent while moving systematically around the perimeter of our camp. We remained in our tent for over an hour, listening to the sounds of something moving through the forest around us. Occasionally, the sounds would stop completely and we would wonder if whatever it was had left the area. But then the movement would resume, always following the same circular pattern around our camp. Around midnight, Grace whispered that she was going to use her flashlight to try to see what was stalking us. I argued against this, preferring to remain hidden in the tent rather than reveal our exact location. But the uncertainty was becoming unbearable and we needed to know what we were dealing with. Grace slowly unzipped the tent and pointed her flashlight into the forest surrounding our campsite. The beam revealed nothing but trees and undergrowth, but the moment the light appeared, all sounds of movement stopped immediately. We waited for 10 minutes before closing the tent, but the forest remained completely silent. Whatever had been circling our camp had either left the area or had stopped moving when we attempted to observe it. The pattern continued throughout the night. Whenever we tried to investigate with light, the sounds would stop. Whenever we retreated into the tent and turned off our lights, the movement would resume within minutes. By dawn, both Grace and I were exhausted and terrified. We had spent the entire night listening to something large and intelligent stalking our campsite, but we had been unable to identify what it was or determine its intentions. When sunrise provided enough light to examine our campsite, we discovered evidence that confirmed our fears about the previous night's activity. Around our tent, at a consistent distance of approximately 30 feet, there was a clear trail where something had been moving in a circle. The trail showed disturbed vegetation, broken branches, and occasional impressions in the soft earth. But the tracks were unlike anything either of us had seen before. The impressions were large, much bigger than bear paws or moose hooves, and they showed a foot structure that appeared almost human but with elongated toes and what looked like claw marks. The stride length suggested something with very long legs, and the depth of the impressions indicated substantial weight. Most unsettling was the intelligence demonstrated by the movement pattern. This was not random animal behavior or territorial marking. Something had deliberately and systematically circled our campsite for hours, maintaining perfect distance and changing direction when it encountered obstacles. Grace and I made the decision to cut our expedition short and paddle out immediately. We broke camp as quickly as possible and loaded our canoe, constantly watching the tree line for any signs of movement or additional wildlife activity. The paddle out was tense and exhausting. We maintained a fast pace, stopping only when necessary for portages and navigation. Throughout the day, we felt like we were being observed, although we never saw direct evidence of anything following us. During one portage, Grace discovered additional tracks similar to what we had found at our campsite. The tracks led from the water's edge up the portage trail, and then back down to the water on the other side. Something had been following the same route we were using, and it had been there recently. We completed the portage as quickly as possible and continued paddling, pushing ourselves to cover more distance than we had planned for a single day. By evening, we had reached a lake system that was only 1 day's paddle from our exit point, but we decided to continue paddling into the night rather than camping again in the wilderness. Using our headlamps and following our GPS, we paddled through the darkness until we reached the final lake before our exit point. We made a cold camp on a small island, taking turns staying awake to watch for any signs that we were still being followed. The night passed without incident, and we completed our exit the following morning, reaching our vehicle and civilization with profound relief. When we reported our experience to park authorities, they listened carefully but offered no explanation for what we had encountered. They did note that there had been other reports of unusual wildlife activity in the same area, including tracks that did not match known species and sightings of large animals that could not be positively identified. Grace and I continue to canoe together, but we have never returned to that area of northern Ontario. The experience fundamentally changed our understanding of what exists in the deep wilderness areas of Canada, and we now plan our routes more carefully to avoid areas with reports of unusual wildlife activity. What stalked us during those 2 nights was something that combined the size and strength of a large predator with intelligence and behavioral patterns that seemed almost human. It demonstrated patience, systematic thinking, and an understanding of our routines that went far beyond normal animal behavior. I do not know what species we encountered in the Quetico wilderness, but I know it was real and that it posed a significant threat to our safety. The remote wilderness areas of northern Canada contain mysteries that are not accounted for in any wildlife management guides, and canoeists who venture into these areas should be prepared for encounters that cannot be explained through conventional understanding of wildlife behavior. My name is Luke, and this is a different story from the one I shared earlier about high-altitude mountaineering. This experience occurred during a winter overlanding expedition in the remote Forest Service roads of northwestern Montana, where I had traveled to photograph wildlife during the harsh winter months. I am an experienced winter outdoorsman and photographer who has spent countless nights alone in my vehicle in remote locations. What happened to me during 3 days snowed in on a Forest Service road near Glacier National Park challenged my understanding of what exists in the deep wilderness during Montana's brutal winters. I had driven north from Missoula in early January, seeking opportunities to photograph wolves, mountain goats, and other wildlife that become more visible during winter months when snow forces them to lower elevations. My plan was to explore a network of Forest Service roads that provided access to wildlife habitat while allowing me to sleep in my truck, which was equipped with a camper shell, sleeping system, and emergency supplies for extended winter camping. My vehicle was a heavy-duty pickup truck with 4-wheel drive, snow tires, and recovery equipment. I carried enough food, water, and fuel for 2 weeks of self-sufficient camping, along with cold weather gear rated for Montana winter conditions. I also had communication equipment including a satellite messenger and emergency beacon. The Forest Service road I selected accessed high elevation areas that remained open to vehicle traffic during winter, though they were rarely used due to challenging snow conditions. According to my research, this road provided access to prime wildlife habitat and offered numerous camping opportunities for self-contained vehicles. I drove into the mountains on a Tuesday morning following the plowed main highway until I reached the turnoff for the Forest Service road system. The secondary roads had not been plowed, but they were passable with 4-wheel drive and showed evidence of occasional use by other winter recreationalists. For the first 2 days, everything went according to plan. I found several excellent wildlife photography locations and established temporary camps where I could observe animal activity during the early morning and evening hours, when wildlife was most active. The weather was cold but stable, with temperatures ranging from -10 to +15 degrees Fahrenheit. On Thursday morning, I drove deeper into the Forest Service road network, following increasingly narrow and challenging routes toward areas that my maps indicated would provide access to remote wilderness boundaries. The snow was deeper at higher elevations, but my truck handled the conditions without difficulty. Around noon, I stopped to photograph a herd of elk that was feeding in a meadow visible from the road. While I was setting up my camera equipment, light snow began falling. The weather forecast had predicted possible snow, but nothing that would create travel problems. However, the snowfall intensified rapidly throughout the afternoon. What had started as light flurries became heavy snow that significantly reduced visibility and began accumulating on the roads. By 4 o'clock, I realized that I needed to start driving back toward the main highway before the roads became impassable. But when I attempted to drive out, I discovered that the snow had already made the Forest Service roads extremely difficult to navigate. My truck was slipping and sliding despite four-wheel drive, and I was making very slow progress toward the main road system. The snow continued falling heavily, and I could see that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. As darkness approached, I made the decision to stop and wait for better conditions rather than risk getting stuck or sliding off the narrow mountain roads. I found a relatively level area where I could park safely and activated my emergency beacon to notify authorities of my location and situation. I settled into my truck for what I expected would be an uncomfortable but manageable night, planning to attempt driving out in the morning when I could see road conditions clearly. My truck was well equipped for winter camping, and I had experienced similar situations before without serious problems. The snowfall continued throughout the night, and by morning I discovered that my truck was partially buried and the roads were completely impassable. The storm had deposited over 2 feet of new snow, and the Forest Service roads would require plowing or significant warming before they could be used safely. I activated my satellite communicator and reported my situation to emergency services, providing my GPS coordinates and explaining that I was safe, but would need assistance to exit the area. I was told that road crews would clear the Forest Service roads as soon as weather conditions permitted, but that might require several days depending on additional snowfall. This was disappointing but not alarming. I had supplies for 2 weeks and was comfortable in my vehicle. I had been in similar situations before and knew that patience was required when winter weather created travel problems in remote areas. But on the second night of being snowed in, I began experiencing something that transformed a routine winter camping situation into a terrifying survival ordeal. Around midnight, I was awakened by sounds outside my truck that seemed to be human voices calling my name. The voices were distant but clear, coming from different directions around my camping location. They were calling Luke repeatedly, sometimes individually and sometimes in overlapping conversations. This was impossible. I was miles from any other people, snowed in on a remote Forest Service road that had been impassable for 2 days. There was no way anyone else could have reached my location on foot through deep snow in sub-zero temperatures. I remained in my sleeping bag, listening carefully to try to determine the source of the voices. They continued for approximately 20 minutes, sometimes seeming to move closer to my truck and sometimes fading into the distance. The voices sounded urgent, as if people were searching for me and calling for me to respond. Despite the apparent urgency in the voices, something about them felt wrong. The tone was too perfect, too consistent, as if someone was imitating human speech rather than actually speaking naturally. And the fact that they knew my name was deeply troubling, since no one else should have been aware of my presence in this remote location. I decided not to respond to the voices, instead remaining silent and hidden in my truck. After about half an hour, the calling stopped completely and the forest returned to its normal winter silence. The following night, the voices returned, but this time they were closer and more persistent. They seemed to be coming from just outside my truck, and they were not just calling my name but engaging in conversations that appeared designed to trick me into responding. The voices would call my name, then pause as if waiting for a response. When I remained silent, they would begin talking among themselves, discussing my situation and expressing concern about my welfare. They mentioned details about my location and circumstances that should not have been known to anyone else. Most disturbing was when the voices began imitating people I knew. I heard conversations that sounded like my family members and friends, discussing plans to rescue me and asking me to come out of my truck so they could help me. The imitations were nearly perfect, capturing speech patterns and vocal characteristics accurately enough to be convincing. But I knew that none of these people could possibly be present in this remote location during a winter storm. The voices were attempts to lure me out of the safety of my vehicle, though I could not determine who or what was making these sounds or why they wanted me to leave my truck. Throughout the third night, the voices became more aggressive and desperate. They began claiming that there was an emergency, that someone was injured and needed my help, that search and rescue teams were nearby and needed me to signal my location. The urgency in the voices was compelling, and there were moments when I almost convinced myself that I should investigate. But something deeper than rational thought warned me to remain hidden in my truck. Every instinct I had developed during years of wilderness experience told me that responding to these voices would be dangerous, regardless of how convincing they sounded. The voices continued until dawn, sometimes fading into the distance and sometimes seeming to come from directly outside my windows. Occasionally I heard sounds of movement around my truck, as if people were walking through the deep snow and examining my vehicle. But when I looked out through my windows, I never saw anyone or any tracks in the snow around my camping area. On the fourth morning, I heard the sound of actual human voices and machinery approaching my location. A search and rescue team had reached me using snowmobiles and a tracked vehicle, following the GPS coordinates I had provided through my satellite communicator. The rescue team was able to clear enough snow around my truck to allow me to drive out behind their tracked vehicle, following a route they had broken through the deep snow. The evacuation went smoothly, and I reached the main highway system without further incident. When I described the voices I had heard during the previous 3 nights, the search and rescue coordinator told me that they had received similar reports from other people who had been stranded alone in remote winter locations. He could not explain the phenomenon, but he said that people who spend extended time alone in extreme winter conditions sometimes experience auditory hallucinations or other perceptual disturbances. This explanation might have satisfied me, except for one detail that the rescue team discovered when they examined my campsite. Around my truck, at distances ranging from 20 to 50 feet, there were tracks in the snow that appeared to have been made by people walking in circles around my vehicle. The tracks were clear and well-defined, showing boot prints in patterns that suggested systematic surveillance of my camping location. But according to the rescue team, no search and rescue personnel had been to my location prior to their arrival that morning. The tracks had been made by unknown individuals who had somehow reached my remote location during the storm and had spent considerable time observing my truck. I never received a satisfactory explanation for the voices or the tracks. The experience convinced me that remote winter locations in Montana can host activities and encounters that are not accounted for in any wilderness safety training, and that survival sometimes requires ignoring apparently human voices that call from the darkness.